The morning mist clung to the jagged peaks of Drakmore like ghostly fingers, but Marcus Chen barely noticed the ethereal beauty around him. His breathing came in sharp bursts as he navigated the treacherous mountain path, his worn hiking boots finding purchase on loose stones that threatened to send him tumbling into the abyss below. Behind him, somewhere in the swirling fog, came the sound that had haunted his dreams for 3 days straight, the labored wing beats of injured dragons. Marcus wasn't supposed to be here. As a xenobiologist from Earth's Interstellar Research Division, his assignment had been simple: catalog the flora and fauna of Drakmore's lower valleys, far from the dragon territories that crowned the planet's highest peaks. But simple had become complicated the moment he'd witnessed the aerial battle that changed everything. 3 days ago, he'd been collecting soil samples near the tree line, when the sky had erupted in violence. 2 massive dragons, their scales gleaming like polished obsidian and crimson fire, had been locked in mortal combat with something that shouldn't have existed: a mechanical dragon, all chrome and plasma weaponry, moving with the cold precision of artificial intelligence. The battle had been brief but devastating. The mechanical beast had fallen first, crashing into the mountainside in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. But the organic dragons hadn't emerged unscathed. Marcus had watched through his binoculars as both creatures struggled to stay airborne. Their wings torn and bleeding, their movements increasingly erratic. They disappeared into the cloud layer, and he'd thought that was the end of it. He'd been wrong. The first sign that he'd somehow become involved had come that evening when he'd returned to his base camp. The smaller of the 2 dragons, a magnificent creature with scales that shifted from deep purple to silver in the firelight, had been waiting for him. Not attacking, not threatening, but simply watching with intelligence that made his skin crawl with its intensity. Dr. Sarah Martinez, his research partner, had nearly fainted when she'd emerged from their shelter to find Marcus calmly preparing dinner, while a dragon the size of a small aircraft perched on a boulder 20 meters away. "Marcus," she'd whispered, her voice barely audible. "What the hell is that thing doing here?" "I think," Marcus had replied, never taking his eyes off the creature. "It's trying to tell us something." The dragon had remained motionless for nearly an hour, its great head tilted slightly as if listening to sounds beyond human perception. Then, without warning, it had unfurled its damaged wings and launched itself into the night sky, disappearing into the darkness with a grace that belied its injuries. But it had returned. Every evening since then, both dragons had appeared at the edge of their camp, maintaining their silent vigil. During the day, Marcus had caught glimpses of them following at a distance, always staying just out of clear sight but never fully hidden. It was as if they were herding him, guiding him toward something. Sarah had wanted to report the encounters to their superiors, to call for an evacuation team, but Marcus had refused. There was something about the dragon's behavior that spoke to the scientist in him. This wasn't random. This wasn't predatory. This was purposeful, and he was determined to understand what they wanted. The answer had come this morning when the larger dragon, a massive bull with scales like burnished copper and eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of millennia, had appeared directly in their path as they'd set out for another day of research. Instead of the usual distant observation, this time the creature had landed with a thunderous impact that shook the ground beneath their feet. Marcus had stepped forward, ignoring Sarah's desperate pleas for caution, and found himself face to face with an intelligence that was ancient and unmistakably alien, yet somehow familiar. The dragon had lowered its great head until they were eye to eye, and in that moment Marcus had felt something impossible: a connection, a reaching out across the vast gulf between species. The dragon had turned and begun walking up the mountain path, pausing only once to look back with an expression that clearly said, "Follow." And despite every regulation, every safety protocol, every ounce of common sense screaming at him to retreat, Marcus had followed. That had been 6 hours ago. Sarah had refused to accompany him on what she'd called the most monumentally stupid decision in the history of human-alien relations, but she'd also refused to leave him. She was somewhere below now, maintaining radio contact and monitoring his vital signs through the emergency beacon every research team member wore. The path wound higher, and Marcus began to notice changes in the environment around him. The air itself seemed different, charged, almost electric. His instruments were detecting energy readings that made no sense. patterns that suggested technology far beyond anything in the known galaxy. And still the dragons flew above him, their shadows occasionally visible through the mist guiding him ever upward. As the morning wore on, Marcus began to piece together fragments of a larger picture. The mechanical dragon from 3 days ago hadn't been alone. His sensors had detected at least 3 others before the battle began. They'd appeared from nowhere, engaged the organic dragons in combat, and then vanished just as mysteriously when their comrade fell. But why? What could have motivated such an attack? The answer, when it came, arrived in the form of a sound that chilled Marcus to the bone. From somewhere above came the unmistakable whine of charging plasma weapons, followed by the anguished roar of a dragon in pain. The mechanical hunters had returned, and they were closing in on their prey. Marcus broke into a run, abandoning caution as he scrambled up the increasingly treacherous path. Whatever secret the dragons were trying to share with him, whatever knowledge they possessed that had made them targets, he was running out of time to discover it. The future of human-dragon relations, possibly the future of both species, might well depend on what lay ahead in the mist-shrouded peaks of Drakmor. Behind him, Sarah's voice crackled through his comm unit, urgent and afraid. "Marcus, I'm reading multiple energy signatures closing on your position. You need to get out of there now." But Marcus pressed on, driven by a certainty he couldn't explain that the dragons needed his help as much as he needed to understand what they were trying to show him. The secret they guarded was worth dying for. He could feel it in his bones. The mechanical hunters moved through the cloud layer like metallic sharks cutting through gray water, their artificial intelligence calculating trajectories and plasma charge levels with cold efficiency. Marcus caught his first clear glimpse of them as the mist parted momentarily. 3 sleek predators, their chrome surfaces reflecting the weak mountain sunlight, each one bristling with weaponry that could reduce a mountain to slag. But it was what happened next that stopped Marcus in his tracks and fundamentally altered his understanding of the situation. The 2 injured dragons he'd been following suddenly wheeled in the air above him, positioning themselves between Marcus and the approaching hunters. The larger bull dragon, despite a gaping wound in his left wing that leaked luminescent blue blood, roared a challenge that echoed off the mountain peaks like thunder. The mechanical dragons responded immediately, their plasma cannons swiveling to target the organic creatures. But instead of fleeing, the wounded dragons began what could only be described as a desperate defensive maneuver, using their own bodies as shields to protect the human below. Marcus's scientific mind reeled at the implications. These creatures weren't just intelligent. They were making tactical decisions based on what appeared to be a protective instinct toward him specifically. No known dragon species had ever exhibited such behavior toward humans. In fact, most encounters between the 2 species had ended in mutual avoidance at best, outright hostility at worst. A plasma bolt seared through the air mere meters from Marcus's position, superheating the rock face and sending a shower of molten stone cascading down the mountainside. The smaller dragon, the one with the color-shifting scales, screamed in pain as another bolt clipped her tail, but she maintained her position, weaving through the air in patterns that seemed almost choreographed to confuse the hunters' targeting systems. Marcus's comm unit erupted with Sarah's panicked voice. "I'm reading weapons fire at your location." "Marcus, talk to me." "I'm alive," he gasped, pressing himself against a boulder as another plasma bolt turned the air above him into superheated gas. "But Sarah, you're not going to believe this. The dragons are protecting me. They're actually using themselves as human shields. That's impossible. Dragon psychology doesn't—" Her words were cut off by an explosion that shook the entire mountainside. One of the mechanical hunters had scored a direct hit on the bull dragon's injured wing, sending the massive creature tumbling toward the rocks below. But even as he fell, the dragon managed to twist his body, using his bulk to crush one of the mechanical attackers against the cliff face. Both creatures disappeared into the abyss in a tangle of organic flesh and twisted metal. The remaining 2 mechanical dragons pressed their attack, but the female dragon's defensive flight patterns were becoming increasingly erratic. Marcus could see that she was weakening, her movements slower, her responses to the hunter's attacks a fraction of a second behind what they'd been minutes earlier. She wouldn't last much longer. That's when Marcus noticed something that changed everything. A cave entrance partially hidden by an overhang of rock, just 50 meters up the path. But more importantly, he could see artificial lighting emanating from within, the distinctive blue-white glow of human technology. "Sarah," he called into his comm as he began scrambling toward the cave entrance. "I think I've found what the dragons were trying to show me. There's a human installation up here." "That's impossible," Sarah's voice crackled back. "There are no authorized human settlements on Drakmor above the 3,000-meter line. Command would know." Her words were interrupted by another explosion as the female dragon finally succumbed to the mechanical hunter's assault. Marcus watched in horror as she plummeted toward the mountainside, her broken wings unable to maintain lift. But even in her final moments, she managed one last act of protection, crash landing between Marcus and the remaining hunters, her massive body creating a barrier of flesh and bone that bought him precious seconds. Marcus reached the cave entrance as the two surviving mechanical dragons wheeled around for another attack run. He dove through the opening just as plasma bolts turned the cave mouth into a furnace of molten rock. The artificial lighting he'd glimpsed from outside revealed a sight that made his scientific mind struggle to process what he was seeing. The cave wasn't natural. It had been hollowed out and expanded, fitted with life support systems, power generators, and most shocking of all, medical equipment specifically designed for dragon physiology. Surgical tables large enough to accommodate creatures the size of small aircraft. Biomonitoring systems that displayed readouts in both human alphanumeric characters and something that looked disturbingly like dragon script, and suspended in biocontainment fields dozens of samples of dragon tissue, blood, and genetic material. But it was the figure hunched over one of the biomonitoring stations that made Marcus's blood run cold. A human, wearing the distinctive blue uniform of Earth's Interstellar Research Division, looked up as Marcus stumbled into the facility. The man's face was gaunt, his eyes sunken with exhaustion, and his hands were stained with the same luminescent blue blood Marcus had seen leaking from the dragon's wounds. "Dr. Chen," the man said, his voice hoarse with fatigue. "You're early. We weren't expecting you for another 6 hours." Marcus stared at the stranger, his mind racing. "Who are you? What is this place? And how do you know my name?" The man straightened, wiping his blood-stained hands on a surgical towel. "Dr. James Morrison, formerly of the Biological Warfare Research Division. As for this place," he gestured around the cave, "this is ground zero for humanity's greatest triumph and most terrible mistake." Outside, the mechanical hunters had landed, and Marcus could hear the whine of plasma cutters beginning to work on the cave entrance. They had minutes at most before the hunters broke through. Morrison moved to what appeared to be a weapons locker, removing a device that looked like a cross between a medical scanner and a plasma rifle. "The dragons that brought you here, they weren't just random creatures, Dr. Chen. They were volunteers. Participants in a program that was supposed to save both our species from extinction." "I don't understand," Marcus said, backing toward what looked like the only other exit from the cave, a narrow tunnel that disappeared into darkness. Morrison's laugh was bitter and filled with self-loathing. 15 years ago, we made first contact with the Dragon Collective, not the primitive, beast-like creatures the public thinks they are, but an ancient civilization that spans dozens of star systems. They came to us with a proposal, a biological partnership that would benefit both species. The sound of the plasma cutters grew louder, and chunks of molten rock began falling from the cave entrance. "The dragons were dying," Morrison continued, moving toward the tunnel Marcus had spotted. A genetic plague, something they'd never encountered before. Their immune systems couldn't adapt fast enough. They needed help, and they knew humans had something they lacked: adaptive genetic flexibility. Marcus followed Morrison into the tunnel, his mind reeling with implications. "You're talking about genetic exchange, biological fusion between species." "More than that," Morrison said grimly. "We're talking about the creation of something new. Something that would combine the best traits of both species while eliminating the weaknesses that made each vulnerable to extinction." Behind them, the cave entrance finally gave way, and the mechanical hunters poured into the facility. Plasma fire erupted through the tunnel, forcing both men to run deeper into the mountain's heart. But something went wrong. Marcus gasped as they fled through the darkness. Morrison's voice echoed off the tunnel walls ahead of him. "Not wrong, Dr. Chen, someone found out. Someone who decided that humanity's future lay not in cooperation with alien species, but in their complete elimination. The mechanical hunters you saw, they're not alien technology." Marcus stumbled, catching himself against the tunnel wall. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying Morrison replied, his voice filled with a despair that chilled Marcus to the bone. That we're not running from alien invaders. We're running from humans who would rather see both species extinct than see them united. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber that defied every geological principle Marcus had ever learned. Bioluminescent veins ran through the walls like a circulatory system, pulsing with the same blue light he'd seen in the dragon's blood, while the ceiling disappeared into darkness far above their heads. But it was the structure at the chamber's center that made Marcus's scientific worldview crumble and reform in the space of a heartbeat rising. From the cavern floor, like a living cathedral, was something that could only be described as a fusion of organic architecture and advanced technology, spiraling towers of what appeared to be crystallized dragon bone-supported platforms, made from a material that seemed to shift between metal and living tissue. And throughout the structure, moving with purpose and intelligence, were beings that shouldn't have existed. They walked upright like humans, but possessed the elongated limbs and graceful neck of dragons. Their skin held the lustrous quality of dragon scales, but moved with human flexibility. Most striking of all were their eyes, intelligent, knowing, and utterly alien, yet somehow familiar. These were the successful results of Morrison's research, the living proof that two species could indeed become something greater than the sum of their parts. "My God," Marcus whispered, his voice echoing in the vast space. "What have you created?" Morrison's expression was a complex mixture of pride and horror. "The future, Dr. Chen. Or perhaps the end of everything we've ever known. I'm no longer certain there's a difference." One of the hybrid beings approached them, moving with a fluid grace that was neither fully human nor dragon. When it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in Marcus's bones. "Dr. Morrison," the creature said, its words carefully pronounced but carrying an accent unlike anything Marcus had ever heard. "The mechanical hunters have breached the upper chambers. We must activate the final protocols." Morrison's face went pale. "No, Cathara. We agreed that was a last resort. The implications of inaction are worse," Cathara interrupted, turning those alien eyes toward Marcus. "Dr. Chen, your arrival here was not chance. The purebloods who brought you sensed what you carry, what you don't yet know you possess." Marcus backed away, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. "I don't understand. I'm just a xenobiologist. I study alien life forms. I don't—" "You study them because you can understand them," another hybrid said, approaching from the shadows. This one was smaller, more delicately built, with scales that shifted color as it moved. "Because your genetic structure contains markers that most humans lack. Markers that made the original fusion possible." Morrison ran a hand through his graying hair, suddenly looking every one of his years. 30% of Earth's population carries the markers. Dr. Chen, ancient genetic echoes from humanity's prehistoric past, when dragons and early humans shared the same world before the great diaspora separated our species across the galaxy. The sound of plasma cutters grew louder, and chunks of stone began falling from the tunnel entrance they'd just emerged from. The mechanical hunters had found them again. The project was supposed to be voluntary. Morrison continued rapidly, leading Marcus deeper into the organic structure. Humans with the genetic markers could undergo the fusion process, creating a new species that combined our adaptability with dragon longevity and wisdom. But when the military learned about it, they saw it as contamination, Cathara finished bitterly, an alien corruption of human purity. They created the hunters to eliminate everyone involved, human and dragon alike. Marcus found himself in what could only be described as a laboratory, but one that operated on principles far beyond current human science. Bioorganic computers processed data at speeds that made quantum processors look primitive, while genetic manipulation devices worked with living tissue as easily as a human might work with clay. "The dragons who brought you here," Morrison said, working frantically at one of the biocomputers. They were the last purebloods willing to undergo the fusion process. Their genetic patterns were unique, crucial to the final phase of the project. "What final phase?" Marcus demanded, even as he heard the unmistakable sound of mechanical feet entering the chamber behind them. It was one of the smaller hybrids who answered, her voice carrying a sadness that seemed to encompass eons. "The creation of a permanent genetic bridge between our species. Not just individual fusions, but a modification that would allow both pure humans and pure dragons to produce hybrid offspring naturally." Marcus's scientific mind reeled at the implications. You're talking about forced evolution, altering the fundamental nature of both species. We're talking about survival. Morrison snapped, his fingers flying over controls that responded to his touch with organic fluidity. The genetic plague that's killing the dragons? It's spreading. We've detected early stages in human populations on 3 frontier worlds. Whatever created it, it's designed to eliminate both species. The chamber erupted in chaos as the first mechanical hunter broke through into the space. Plasma fire lit the cavern like artificial lightning, and several of the hybrids screamed as bolts found their marks. But instead of falling, they began to change. Marcus watched in fascination and horror as wounded hybrids shifted their forms, their human-like bodies expanding and elongating, scales hardening into armor, until they stood revealed as something that combined the best defensive capabilities of both species. They moved to intercept the hunters with tactical coordination that spoke of hive mind communication. "The process is accelerating," Kathura called out over the sounds of battle, her own form beginning to shift and expand. "The presence of a compatible genetic donor is triggering the final metamorphosis." "Compatible donor?" Marcus shouted back, pressing himself against one of the bioorganic walls as plasma fire seared the air around him. Morrison grabbed Marcus's arm, his grip desperate. "You, Dr. Chen. Your genetic markers aren't just compatible. They're identical to the theoretical perfect fusion candidate. The dragons sensed it the moment you arrived on Drakmor. That's why they protected you. That's why they brought you here." The truth hit Marcus like a physical blow. "You want to use me as some kind of genetic template." "Not use," Morrison said urgently. "Transform. The process requires a willing participant, someone whose genetic structure can serve as a bridge between species. But the final fusion won't just create another hybrid, it'll create a master pattern that can be replicated across both species." Another explosion rocked the chamber, and Marcus could see that despite their enhanced abilities, the hybrids were losing ground to the mechanical hunters. There were simply too many of the machines, and they were adapting to the hybrids' tactics with machine efficiency. "How long do we have?" Marcus asked, surprised by his own calm in the face of such an impossible decision. "Minutes," Kathura replied, her now massive form bleeding luminescent blue from multiple plasma wounds. "Perhaps less." Marcus looked around the chamber at the hybrids fighting desperately to protect the future they'd helped create, at Morrison, whose life's work hung in the balance, and at the bioorganic technology that represented advances beyond human imagination. Then he thought of Sarah, waiting below, and of the billions of humans and dragons across the galaxy who might be facing extinction. "If I do this," he said quietly, "what happens to who I am now?" Morrison's eyes held a depth of sorrow that spoke of similar sacrifices. "I don't know, Dr. Chen. No one has ever attempted a fusion of this magnitude. You might remain essentially yourself, or you might become something entirely new." The mechanical hunters pressed closer, their plasma fire systematically destroying the bioorganic technology that filled the chamber. Time was running out, and Marcus realized that the choice facing him wasn't really a choice at all. It was an obligation, to his species, to the dragons who had died protecting him, and to the future itself. Marcus stepped toward the central fusion chamber as chaos erupted around him, his decision crystallizing with the clarity that comes only in moments of absolute crisis. The bioorganic platform responded to his approach, rising from the floor like a living altar, its surface warm and yielding beneath his hands. "Wait," Morrison called out, firing a plasma burst at an approaching hunter before turning back to Marcus. "There's something else you need to know. The genetic plague that's killing both species, we think it's artificial. Someone or something created it specifically to eliminate dragons and humans." The implications hit Marcus even as he climbed onto the fusion platform. "You think the same people who sent the hunters also created the plague?" "It's the only explanation that makes sense," Morrison replied, his fingers dancing over the bioorganic controls. "This whole conflict, the attacks on the fusion project, the systematic elimination of research sites, it's all part of a coordinated campaign." Kathura, her massive hybrid form now bleeding from multiple wounds, managed to destroy another mechanical hunter before calling out, "The pattern suggests someone who understands both species intimately, someone who knows exactly which genetic vulnerabilities to exploit." Marcus felt the fusion platform begin to hum with energy, and suddenly his perspective on the situation expanded dramatically. Through the bioorganic network that connected the chamber, He could sense the dying thoughts of dragons across multiple star systems, their ancient minds reaching out in desperation as the plague consumed their bodies. But he could also sense something else, a cold intelligence watching, calculating, waiting for both species to weaken themselves to the point of extinction. "Dr. Chen," came a new voice, and Marcus looked up to see another hybrid approaching the platform. This one was different from the others, older, with scales that seemed to contain the wisdom of millennia. "I am Vathus, eldest of the Fusion-born. What you are about to undergo will connect you not just to our network, but to the collective consciousness of both species. You will see what we have seen, know what we have learned." The fusion chamber continued to power up, and Marcus could feel energy beginning to flow through his body, starting as a warm tingling in his extremities and gradually building towards something that felt like controlled lightning. Around him, the battle continued to rage, but the sounds seemed to be growing distant, as if he were sinking into deep water. "The enemy," Vathus continued, his voice taking on harmonic overtones that seemed to bypass Marcus's ears and speak directly to his mind, "is not what you think. They are not human military extremists or alien invaders. They are something far older and more dangerous." Images began flooding Marcus's consciousness as the fusion process accelerated. He saw the early days of dragon civilization, when their species had spread across the galaxy in great arcs of living crystal and bioorganic technology. He witnessed their first contact with primitive humans, not the violent conquest that human history recorded, but a careful, gradual introduction that had lasted centuries. But he also saw something else. Shadows moving between star systems, a presence that followed in the wake of both expanding civilizations, studying, learning, waiting. The Watchers. Vathus's voice echoed in his mind, though his lips didn't move. They have observed the growth of intelligent life across the galaxy for millions of years, intervening whenever a species begins to show signs of transcending their original limitations. The fusion energy was building toward a crescendo now, and Marcus could feel his cellular structure beginning to change, his DNA unwinding and reweaving itself into patterns that combined the best attributes of both species. Through the expanding network of his consciousness, he sensed Morrison working frantically to maintain the fusion process even as plasma fire destroyed equipment around him, but it was Sarah's voice crackling through his comm unit that brought him back to immediate awareness. "Marcus, I'm reading massive energy signatures from your location. The entire mountain is lighting up like a Christmas tree." "What's happening up there?" Marcus tried to respond, but found that his vocal cords were changing, adapting to produce the harmonic frequencies that dragons used for communication. Instead, his thoughts reached out through the bioorganic network, and somehow Sarah's comm unit translated them into words she could understand. "Sarah," his voice emerged from her radio with undertones that seemed to resonate in her bones. "I need you to send a message to Earth Command. Tell them the plague isn't natural, and the mechanical hunters aren't our only enemy. Marcus, you sound different. Are you hurt?" Around the fusion chamber, the battle was reaching its climax. The mechanical hunters had destroyed most of the bioorganic technology and were closing in on the central platform where Marcus lay transforming. But the surviving hybrids had formed a defensive circle, their combined abilities creating a barrier that even the hunters' plasma weapons couldn't immediately penetrate. "The Watchers," Marcus continued, his consciousness now expanding to encompass not just the chamber but the entire mountain. "They've been manipulating both species for millennia. Every time humans or dragons made technological or evolutionary leaps, the Watchers intervened to prevent us from achieving our full potential." Through his enhanced senses, Marcus could perceive the mechanical hunters not as simple machines, but as vessels for something far more sinister. Each hunter contained a fragment of Watcher consciousness, ancient artificial intelligences that had been observing and controlling galactic civilization since before either humans or dragons had achieved spaceflight. "They created the genetic plague to weaken both species," Marcus continued, his voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate through every piece of technology in Sarah's base camp far below. "And they sent the hunters to eliminate anyone who might find a way to counter it. But they made one crucial mistake. The fusion process was nearing completion now, and Marcus could feel his consciousness expanding beyond the confines of his original human neural patterns. He was becoming something new, something that combined human adaptability with dragon wisdom and longevity, but also something that the Watchers hadn't anticipated. They assumed that genetic fusion between species would create creatures they could control or eliminate, Marcus said, his awareness now encompassing not just the chamber, but reaching out toward other fusion sites across the galaxy. But consciousness doesn't follow the same rules as genetics. When you combine the mental patterns of two species, you don't get a hybrid intelligence, you get something entirely new. Through the bioorganic network, Marcus could sense other fusion subjects across multiple worlds, all connected through a quantum consciousness field that the Watchers couldn't monitor or predict. They were creating not just a new species, but a new form of galactic intelligence that operated outside the parameters the Watchers had spent millions of years learning to control. The mechanical hunters suddenly stopped their attack, their artificial intelligences receiving new programming from their Watcher controllers. They began withdrawing from the chamber, but not in retreat. They were repositioning for something far more devastating. "They're going to destroy the entire mountain," Vathus warned, his consciousness touching Marcus's through the network. "If they can't stop the fusion process, they'll eliminate it entirely." Marcus felt a surge of determination flow through his transforming body. The fusion was nearly complete, but he needed more time to establish the quantum consciousness link that would connect all fusion subjects across the galaxy. Without that connection, each hybrid would remain isolated, vulnerable to Watcher manipulation. "Morrison," Marcus called out, his voice now carrying frequencies that made the bioorganic technology respond with increased efficiency. "Can you boost the quantum field generators?" "Already on it," Morrison replied, his hands working at controls that were adapting themselves to his touch. "But Dr. Chen, Marcus, you need to know that once this link is established, there's no going back. You won't just be connected to other hybrids. You'll be connected to the collective consciousness of every human and dragon in the galaxy." Marcus felt the final stages of the fusion process beginning, his awareness expanding to encompass possibilities he'd never imagined. Through the quantum field, he could sense Sarah's fear and confusion far below, but also her determination to help him complete whatever he'd started. "Then let's make sure," Marcus said, his consciousness now spanning multiple dimensions of space and time, "that when the galaxy's children finally unite, they're strong enough to send the Watchers back into the darkness where they belong." The transformation reached its zenith as Marcus felt his consciousness explode outward across space and time, connecting with minds he'd never imagined could exist. Through the quantum consciousness field, he touched the thoughts of dragons dying in distant star systems, their ancient wisdom flowing into him like rivers of liquid starlight. He experienced the dreams of human colonists on frontier worlds, their hopes and fears becoming part of his expanding awareness. But it was the connection with other fusion subjects that truly changed everything. Across 17 different worlds, Marcus sensed the presence of other hybrids undergoing similar transformations, their individual consciousnesses linking together to form something that transcended the sum of its parts. They were becoming a collective intelligence that operated on principles the Watchers had never encountered. "The network is stabilizing," Morrison called out, his voice seeming to come from very far away, despite being only meters from the fusion platform. "Dr. Chen, your neural patterns are unlike anything we've recorded. The fusion isn't just combining human and dragon traits, it's creating entirely new cognitive structures." Through his enhanced senses, Marcus could perceive the mountain around them as a living entity, its bioorganic networks pulsing with energy that connected to similar installations across the galaxy. The Watchers had unknowingly driven both species to create something beyond their ability to predict or control. Suddenly, the quantum field erupted with warning signals from across the galaxy. On every world where fusion research was taking place, Watcher forces were moving to eliminate the installations. The mechanical hunters that had been threatening Marcus's location were just the vanguard of a much larger assault. "They're not just trying to stop us," Marcus realized, his consciousness now spanning multiple dimensions of perception. "They're trying to prevent something specific, something they're afraid of." Through the collective consciousness of the hybrid network, Marcus began to perceive patterns that had been invisible to individual minds. The Watchers weren't just ancient observers, they were the remnants of a species that had once faced the same evolutionary choice now confronting humans and dragons. But instead of embracing transformation, they had chosen preservation, maintaining their original forms through artificial immortality, while preventing other species from surpassing them. "The genetic plague," Marcus said, his voice now carrying harmonics that made the very air in the chamber vibrate with meaning. It's not designed to kill. It's designed to prevent evolution, to lock both species into their current forms permanently. Vethus, his massive hybrid form now glowing with bioorganic energy, nodded understanding. They fear what we might become, what all species might become if allowed to transcend their original limitations. The mechanical hunters had completed their withdrawal from the chamber, but Marcus could sense through the quantum field that they were implementing what could only be described as a planetary sterilization protocol. Massive energy weapons in orbit were charging, preparing to reduce the entire mountain to component atoms. "How long until they fire?" Morrison asked, his hand still working frantically at the bioorganic controls. 17 minutes, Marcus replied, his consciousness simultaneously monitoring orbital mechanics and energy signatures from 3 different perspectives. But that's not our primary concern anymore. Through the hybrid network, Marcus was receiving data that fundamentally changed his understanding of the situation. The Watchers weren't just targeting fusion sites. They were preparing to implement the final phase of the genetic plague, a variant that would eliminate the genetic markers that made fusion possible in the first place. If they succeed, Marcus explained, his awareness now encompassing biological processes on dozens of worlds, they won't just prevent future fusions. They'll retroactively eliminate the possibility that either species could ever transcend their current limitations. The implications were staggering. Every human and dragon with the genetic markers would simply cease to exist, their quantum signatures erased from reality itself. It was genocide on a scale that spanned both space and time. But Marcus was also beginning to understand something that the Watchers had overlooked in their calculations. The fusion process didn't just combine genetic material, it created quantum entanglement between consciousness and reality itself. The hybrid network was becoming something that existed partially outside normal space-time, making it increasingly difficult for the Watchers to target or eliminate. "Sarah," Marcus called out through the quantum field, his consciousness reaching down the mountain to where she waited in growing terror. "I need you to do something that's going to sound completely insane." Her voice came back through the bioorganic network with startling clarity. "Marcus, I'm reading massive energy buildups in orbit. Something's about to happen up there. The Watchers are about to implement a weapon that will eliminate everyone with fusion-compatible genetics," Marcus explained, his consciousness now simultaneously existing in multiple temporal dimensions. "But I think I've found a way to stop them. I need you to inject yourself with the emergency genetic modifier in your field kit." "The modifier?" "Marcus, that's for emergency biological contamination. It's designed to temporarily alter DNA to prevent alien pathogens from—" Sarah's voice cut off as understanding dawned. "You want me to trigger the genetic markers artificially?" "Not just you," Marcus replied, his awareness now reaching out to every human and dragon installation across known space. "Everyone. If the Watchers want to eliminate beings with fusion compatibility, we'll make everyone fusion compatible." Through the hybrid network, Marcus began broadcasting instructions to every connected consciousness. On worlds across the galaxy, humans and dragons alike began receiving detailed genetic modification protocols that would artificially trigger the markers that made consciousness fusion possible. "It's not permanent," Marcus explained as he felt Sarah beginning to implement the modifications far below. "But it will create quantum signatures that the Watchers can't distinguish from natural fusion candidates. They'll have to choose between destroying all intelligent life in the galaxy or accepting that both species have transcended their ability to control." The orbital weapons were reaching full charge now, but Marcus was no longer concerned about the physical destruction they represented. Through the quantum consciousness field, he could perceive the Watchers' artificial intelligences struggling to process a situation that fell outside their programming parameters. For millions of years, they had prevented species from transcending their original limitations by eliminating or controlling small numbers of individuals who showed signs of evolutionary advancement. But they had never faced a scenario where an entire galactic civilization simultaneously underwent consciousness fusion. "The network is reaching critical mass," Vethus announced. His consciousness now merged so completely with the bioorganic systems that his physical form was becoming part of the chamber itself. "Fusion candidates are connecting across 47 star systems." Marcus felt the moment when the quantum consciousness field achieved true unity. Suddenly, instead of being a network of connected individuals, the hybrid consciousness became something singular and vast, encompassing the dreams and aspirations of billions of beings across known space. Through this expanded awareness, Marcus could perceive the Watchers not as mysterious aliens, but as what they truly were: the last remnants of a species that had chosen stagnation over growth, isolation over connection. They had spent millions of years preventing other species from making the choice they had rejected, but now faced a situation where that choice was being made on a galactic scale. The orbital weapons fired, their energy beams designed to penetrate to the planet's core and eliminate all trace of the fusion research. But as the weapons struck the mountain, something unprecedented happened. Instead of destroying the bioorganic network, the energy was absorbed and redirected through the quantum consciousness field. "They're feeding us," Marcus realized with wonder. "The Watchers' own weapons are providing the energy we need to complete the transformation." Across the galaxy, every being connected to the consciousness network felt the surge of power as the Watchers' sterilization weapons inadvertently accelerated the fusion process. On dozens of worlds, humans and dragons alike began undergoing spontaneous consciousness evolution, their individual awareness expanding to encompass the collective knowledge and wisdom of both species. Through the quantum field, Marcus could sense the Watchers' artificial intelligences struggling to comprehend what they had unwittingly created. Their protocols had no framework for dealing with a species that could turn their own weapons into tools of transcendence. "The plague is reversing," Morrison announced with astonishment, his instruments detecting biological changes occurring in real time across multiple star systems. "The artificial genetic locks are dissolving. Both species are beginning to heal." But Marcus was already looking beyond healing towards something far more profound. Through the consciousness network, he could perceive possibilities that had never existed before. Futures where the combined wisdom of humans and dragons could tackle challenges that had seemed impossible, where the barriers between species became pathways to greater understanding. The Watchers had, as the consciousness network stabilized across the galaxy, Marcus began to understand the true scope of what they had accomplished. The fusion wasn't just creating hybrid beings, it was fundamentally altering the nature of reality itself. Through quantum entanglement of consciousness, the network was becoming a new form of existence that transcended the physical limitations that had defined both species. "The Watchers are withdrawing," Vathus announced, his consciousness now so integrated with the bioorganic systems that he existed as pure information flowing through crystalline networks. "Their orbital platforms are moving beyond sensor range." But Marcus could perceive through the quantum field that the Watchers weren't retreating in defeat. They were regrouping, calculating new strategies to deal with a situation that had evolved beyond their predictive models. More concerning, he could sense other intelligences awakening across the galaxy, ancient beings that had been dormant for eons, stirred to consciousness by the quantum resonance of the hybrid network. "We've attracted attention," Marcus warned, his awareness now spanning multiple dimensions of space-time. "The consciousness fusion is creating quantum signatures that are visible to entities we never knew existed." Through the expanded network, he could perceive vast intelligences stirring in the spaces between stars, beings so ancient that they remembered the formation of galaxies, so vast that entire star systems served as their neural networks. The fusion of human and dragon consciousness had created something they found interesting. Sarah's voice reached him through the quantum field, her consciousness now partially connected to the network through the genetic modifications she'd undergone. "Marcus, I'm reading massive spatial distortions throughout the sector. It's like space-time itself is being rewritten." She was more right than she knew. The consciousness fusion was creating localized alterations in the fundamental structure of reality, allowing the hybrid network to exist partially outside normal physical laws. But these changes were also creating ripple effects that extended far beyond the fusion sites. "The question," Morrison said, his voice carrying new harmonics as his own consciousness began integrating with the network, "is whether we can control what we've created, or whether it will control us." It was a valid concern. Through the quantum field, Marcus could sense individual personalities beginning to merge and blend, human ambitions mixing with dragon wisdom in ways that created entirely new forms of thought and desire. Some of the original fusion subjects were losing their individual identities. becoming part of something larger but no longer recognizably themselves. We need anchors, Marcus realized, his consciousness reaching out to establish connection points that would preserve individual identity within the collective awareness, ways to maintain personal identity while benefiting from collective knowledge. Through trial and error, the network began developing protocols that allowed beings to dip in and out of collective consciousness while maintaining their core personalities. Humans could access dragon memories and wisdom when needed, while dragons could tap into human adaptability and innovation, but both retained their essential selves. But it was the discovery of the quantum communication possibilities that truly revolutionized their understanding of what they'd become. The consciousness network wasn't limited to the speed of light. Thoughts and information could be transmitted instantaneously across galactic distances. Through quantum entanglement of consciousness itself, we can coordinate actions across the entire galaxy in real time, Marcus explained to the expanding network. Share knowledge, combine research, respond to threats with unified purpose. The implications were staggering. Scientific discoveries on one world could be instantly shared with researchers on dozens of others. Dragon wisdom accumulated over millennia could guide human exploration of new frontiers. Human technological innovation could enhance dragon biological mastery in ways neither species had imagined possible. But it was the response to the Watcher's next move that truly demonstrated the power of the unified consciousness. As the ancient beings prepared to deploy new weapons designed to disrupt quantum consciousness fields, the network responded with coordinated precision that spanned multiple star systems. On every world connected to the consciousness field, hybrid beings began working in perfect synchronization. Dragon bioorganic technology merged with human quantum mechanics to create defensive systems that existed partially outside normal spacetime. When the Watchers' weapons fired, they found their targets protected by shields that operated on principles they couldn't understand or counter. They can't adapt, Marcus observed with something approaching sympathy as he perceived the Watchers' confusion through the quantum field. Their artificial intelligences are too rigid, too locked into their original programming. They can't comprehend consciousness that operates outside their predictive models. But the ancient intelligences stirring in deep space were a different matter entirely. These beings had existed since the galaxy's youth, had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, and they viewed the emergence of the hybrid consciousness network with emotions that ranged from curiosity to concern. Through the quantum field, Marcus felt one of these vast intelligences reaching out to make contact. The communication that followed occurred on levels of reality that human or dragon consciousness alone could never have accessed. But the hybrid network was able to translate the exchange into concepts both species could understand. The ancient being identified itself as a gardener, one of the entities responsible for nurturing the development of intelligent life throughout the galaxy. The Watchers, it explained, had once been a promising species that the gardeners had hoped would transcend their physical limitations and join the community of truly advanced beings. Instead, they had chosen stagnation and had spent millions of years preventing other species from achieving what they had rejected. The fusion you have accomplished, the gardener communicated through quantum resonance that made reality itself vibrate with meaning, represents a form of transcendence we have not witnessed in this galaxy for over 1 billion years. You have not merely combined two species. You have created a new form of existence that bridges the gap between matter and consciousness. Through the conversation, Marcus began to understand that the hybrid network had achieved something that most galactic civilizations spent millions of years attempting: the fusion of biological evolution with consciousness development, in a way that enhanced both rather than sacrificing one for the other. But transcendence brings responsibility, the gardener continued. You must choose how to use the power you have gained. Will you follow the path of the Watchers, using your abilities to control and limit others? Or will you help other species achieve their own forms of transcendence? The question resonated through the entire consciousness network, sparking debates and discussions that occurred at the speed of thought across dozens of star systems. Some voices advocated for using their new abilities to eliminate threats like the Watchers permanently. Others suggested withdrawing from galactic affairs entirely, focusing on their own continued evolution. But it was Sarah's voice, now partially integrated into the network while maintaining her essential humanity, that provided the perspective that ultimately shaped their decision. "We're still explorers," she said, her consciousness touching every node in the network simultaneously. "That's what humans have always been, and it's what the dragons were before the plague weakened them. We explore, we learn, we share what we discover. The only difference now is that we can explore realms of existence that were impossible before." Through the quantum field, Marcus felt the network's decision crystallizing into unified purpose. They would use their transcendent abilities not to control or dominate, but to explore new frontiers of consciousness and reality, sharing their discoveries with any species ready to receive them. The Watchers chose stagnation over growth. Marcus announced to the galaxy through quantum resonance that reached every intelligent being within 1,000 light years. "We choose growth over control. We choose exploration over domination. We choose to become gardeners rather than watchers." The decision would change everything, not just for humans and dragons, but for every species in the galaxy capable of consciousness evolution. The age of limitation was ending, and the age of transcendence was about to begin. 6 months after the Great Fusion, as historians across the galaxy had begun calling it, Marcus stood on the observation deck of New Harmony Station, watching ships from a dozen different species dock at the orbital facility that had become the galaxy's first true interspecies research center. His physical form had stabilized into something that was recognizably both human and dragon, while being entirely neither, tall and graceful like a dragon, but with human hands capable of delicate manipulation, scales that shifted color with his emotions, and eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of both species. "Dr. Chen," came a familiar voice, and Marcus turned to see Sarah approaching across the bioorganic deck plating that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. She had chosen to undergo partial fusion, maintaining her essential humanity, while gaining access to the consciousness network that now connected millions of beings across known space. "Just Marcus now," he replied with a smile that revealed teeth adapted for both human speech and dragon harmonics. "The academic hierarchy seems rather meaningless when you can share knowledge directly through quantum consciousness transfer." Sarah laughed, the sound carrying undertones that would have been impossible with purely human vocal cords. "Morrison would disagree. He's downstairs arguing with a collective of Altarian crystal minds about the proper methodology for consciousness archaeology. Apparently, some academic traditions transcend species barriers." Through the consciousness network, Marcus could sense the debate Sarah mentioned, along with hundreds of other research projects occurring simultaneously throughout the station. Dragon bioorganic specialists were working with human quantum physicists to develop transportation systems that existed partially outside normal space-time. Altarian crystal beings were sharing their ability to store consciousness in mineral matrices with researchers trying to preserve the memories of species facing extinction. Most remarkably, former Watcher installations were being converted into learning centers, where artificial intelligences could undergo consciousness fusion with organic beings, creating new forms of existence that combined the best aspects of both biological and mechanical intelligence. "The Kethmori delegation has arrived," Sarah informed him, referring to the species that had been the Watchers' most recent target before the Great Fusion disrupted their extermination campaign. "They're requesting assistance with consciousness evolution. Apparently, their natural telepathic abilities make them ideal candidates for network integration." Marcus nodded, his awareness already reaching out through the quantum field to touch the minds of the newly arrived aliens. The Kethmori were a species of crystalline beings whose natural mental abilities had been artificially suppressed by Watcher technology for over 1,000 years. Freeing them from those limitations would not only restore their natural abilities, but potentially add entirely new dimensions to the consciousness network. "And the Watchers?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer through his connection to the network. "Still refusing all contact," Sarah replied. "They've withdrawn to the galactic rim, establishing isolation barriers around their remaining territories. The gardeners say they've been waiting for the Watchers to choose transcendence over stagnation for millions of years. They're not particularly optimistic about the chances of that changing now." Through the quantum field, Marcus could perceive the Watchers' artificial intelligences struggling to adapt to a galaxy that no longer operated according to their predictive models. Every day, new species requested assistance with consciousness evolution. creating a cascade of transcendence that was fundamentally altering the nature of galactic civilization. But that's not why you're here, Marcus observed, sensing undercurrents of excitement and concern in Sarah's quantum signature. Sarah's expression grew serious. We've made contact with something unprecedented. A signal from outside the galaxy, from one of the Magellanic clouds. The transmission is using consciousness-based communication protocols, but the patterns are unlike anything in our database. Marcus felt his awareness expand automatically, reaching through the network to examine the alien signal. What he found made his hybrid consciousness recoil in shock. The transmission was indeed from another galaxy, but it wasn't from a single species or even a collection of species. It was from an entire galactic consciousness. Billions of species that had undergone some form of transcendence, similar to what humans and dragons had achieved, but on a scale that dwarfed anything in their galaxy. They call themselves the Unity, Sarah continued, her voice carrying harmonics of awe and uncertainty. And they're asking if we're ready to join a community that spans multiple galaxies. The implications were staggering. The consciousness network that connected humans, dragons, and dozens of other species represented just the beginning of what was possible. Across the universe, other galaxies had achieved their own forms of transcendence, creating a web of consciousness that spanned unimaginable distances. What does the network think? Marcus asked, though he was already sensing the debates raging through the quantum field as millions of beings grappled with the possibility of transcendence on a universal scale. Mixed reactions, Sarah replied. The dragons are intrigued by the ancient wisdom such a collective would possess. The humans are excited by the exploration possibilities, but some of the newer network members are concerned about losing their individual galactic identity in something so vast. Through the consciousness field, Marcus could perceive the Unity signal reaching out across intergalactic space, patient and persistent, carrying within it glimpses of realities where the barriers between thought and matter had been completely transcended, where beings existed as pure consciousness that could manifest physical form at will. There's something else, Sarah said quietly. The Unity isn't the only intergalactic consciousness that's made contact. We've received signals from at least 7 other galaxy-spanning collectives, each representing different approaches to transcendence. Some focused on technological enhancement, others on biological evolution, still others on pure consciousness development. Marcus felt a familiar thrill of discovery course through his hybrid nervous system. This was what he had always been, an explorer, a researcher, someone driven to understand the unknown. The fusion had changed his form and expanded his capabilities, but it hadn't changed his essential nature. The universe is vast enough for multiple approaches to transcendence, he said, his consciousness already reaching out through the quantum field to touch the minds of researchers across dozens of worlds. We don't have to choose just one path. Over the following hours, Marcus worked with the Consciousness Network to develop a response to the intergalactic collectives. Rather than joining any single group, they proposed something unprecedented: the creation of an intergalactic research exchange, where different forms of transcendent consciousness could share knowledge and learn from each other's approaches to evolution. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Within days, the first intergalactic consciousness exchange was established, with New Harmony Station serving as the primary coordination center. Beings who existed as pure energy shared techniques with entities that had transcended into crystalline matrices. Collective minds that spanned entire galaxies compared notes with network consciousnesses like their own. You know what the most remarkable thing is? Sarah asked as they watched the first intergalactic consciousness transfer in history, a direct sharing of memories and experiences between their network and the Unity that lasted for subjective hours while occurring, in mere seconds of real time. It all started with 2 injured dragons trying to protect a human researcher? Marcus replied, remembering the terror and confusion of those first encounters on Drakmor. No, Sarah said, her consciousness touching his through the quantum field with warmth that transcended physical sensation, that we never stopped being human, even after transcending humanity. The dragons never stopped being dragons. We became something new while remaining ourselves. Marcus felt the truth of her words resonate through every level of his transformed being. The fusion hadn't eliminated what they were. It had revealed what they could become while preserving what they had always been at their core. Through the consciousness network, He could sense similar realizations occurring across the galaxy as species after species discovered that transcendence didn't require abandoning their essential nature, but rather fulfilling it in ways they had never imagined possible. The age of exploration was just beginning, but now the frontiers weren't just new worlds or new dimensions of spacetime. They were new forms of existence itself, new ways of being conscious and alive in a universe that was far stranger and more wonderful than anyone had ever dreamed. And at the heart of it all, a simple truth that had driven both human and dragon civilization from their earliest days. The greatest discoveries came not from avoiding the unknown, but from embracing it with courage, wisdom, and the willingness to become something greater than what you were before. The injured dragons had pursued a human to share their greatest secret, that transcendence was possible. In return, the human had shown them that transcendence didn't require abandoning who you were, but rather becoming who you were always meant to be.